Welcome to my Scholar Talk on Colonial Vietnam, History and Agency, Culture and Power. I am Professor Cindy Wan, an assistant professor in the Department of Information Studies and the Digital Humanities program at UCLA. First of all, I am so sad that I couldn't join you live. I'm actually currently based in Saigon this summer as I conduct some research as well as create some international exchanges with library programs here in Vietnam. So today's lecture, I just wanted to start off by just describing a little bit about this image that I have in the background here. I think it kind of sets a tone for the complexity of understanding the long history of Vietnam, particularly during the French colonial period. So here you have pictured here are three Vietnamese women looking over together a newspaper called Phụ Nữ Tân Văn. So what's interesting here is you might be curious as to, right, well, here's this newspaper that's written in Vietnamese, and there's an ad in the back of Nestle. Now today is a big company originally based in France, but also really exported throughout the world. Nestle candies and all of that is quite popular in the United States as well. And here is actually a cover of a 1930s era Vietnamese language newspaper. And what's interesting here is you have three women who are wearing kind of slightly different, you might be familiar, áo dài, the Vietnamese traditional tunic, as they look over eagerly this newspaper. As you'll understand through this lecture, each of the three women actually represent the three regions of Vietnam. And even them depicting and wearing the áo dài, the so-called traditional Vietnamese outfit, was not even really, quote unquote, invented and popularized until the French colonial period. So you could have this kind of image in mind as you think through kind of the complexity of what it means to think about kind of long Vietnamese history. What is Vietnamese culture? What is Vietnamese history when it's always in the making, always in change, and should be contextualized within many historical elements. So let's continue on. So just for background, all of this lecture and the resources will be available on cindyawen.com, which is my website, which also has many other resources. So first of all, just a bit of who I am and why I study history. First of all, I was raised on the stories of my mom's home, Vietnam. Um, she was born in the South, but her family actually were refugees from the North and came down to the South in 1954. And I always heard these stories of her homeland, Vietnam, and how I came to be in America, how my family fled Vietnam by boat. They tried many times from 75, but they weren't successful until 1987. I was born in a refugee camp in Malaysia, and then it ended up in the United States. For me, though, there was always a cognitive dissonance of growing up in America and not really learning much at school about Vietnam. We learned a little bit about the war, that the United States was involved in this conflict in the 1960s, and the war, quote unquote, ends in 1975. And what I learned in the books was in K through 12 education in the United States was that essentially Vietnam as a country also ends. But then I didn't quite understand it because my family was fleeing by boat from this war-torn country in the 80s, and I wasn't born in a refugee camp until 87. So when I would tell my American kind of classmates or even my teachers I was born in a refugee camp, people would be in disbelief because that didn't make sense. They're like, why? The war was over. Why would you be born in a camp? There was a cognitive dissonance. So I myself didn't know how I ended up in this country, United States, but also where my family fit in this story. So for me, this was the ways I was motivated, the reasons why I was motivated to understand the historical context of how my family fled and left Vietnam, what post-war Vietnam even looked like, and how it was that pushed my family and compelled my family to leave in such dire circumstances. But for me, besides kind of understanding about the Vietnam War, about the 50s, 60s, and 70s, I also wanted to kind of understand if there was a Vietnam beyond the war, to understand kind of how the war manifested, what it meant, what was Vietnamese culture and history, no longer understanding. So here are some kind of drawings, photographs of our family in the camp. Here you have here, this is actually my brother. You can kind of see me peeking out here, my mom and my dad. This is actually when we were first received in the Pulau Bidang, Malaysia camp. And then afterwards, when we were accepted to come to the United States, we were moved to a relocation camp in the Philippines. So here you have kind of more, I guess, adequate living conditions with like more wood and a lot more food. For example, here we are celebrating before we depart, and that's me sticking out as a baby. Here's my family again in front of our wood habitation. Here, my mom carrying me. So this motivated me to study the Vietnam War, thinking like I was born in '88, but where did that fit in the longer history of Vietnam? And I very much positioned the history of Vietnam, thinking through narrative, cultural history, as well as my own positionality. So I'm very motivated to diversify the body of knowledge about Vietnam as well. So I trained and studied and got my PhD in history at UC Berkeley. And for me, I sought to study history because I wanted to reclaim the power of narrative of a place that was, to me, both home and foreign. It was home to my family, but it was also still foreign to me. And I wanted to understand and diversify that knowledge. Even now, today, the body of knowledge about Vietnam is very much limited. If you search on Google Vietnam or Vietnamese history, you'll see many images of war, you'll see pictures of Vietnamese food, but not too much kind of about the longer history of Vietnam. Um, it's either about war or like tourist packages about how to come to Vietnam today. So for me, if you look at my website more clearly on cindyawen.com, I write a lot of book reviews that summarize different types of knowledge about Vietnam and make it available online. A lot of people around the world are able to access these book summaries because they don't have access to the books themselves. I also have some lectures that are recorded here. This one might be of interest to you because it's very much related to the topic today, which is why I study the history of colonial Indochina when I spoke to a community college back in 2020. So for me, history is just one mode of understanding the world. Besides history, I'm also a artist practitioner. And if you go to miss-reading.com, you can see more of my art experience and media poetics, my discussions around feminism and public engagement. So for example, here is the screening of a short film I made with my mom called The Undeniable Force of Khó Khăn, which is a short film about 10 minutes where I and my mother work through certain Vietnamese meanings of Vietnamese words and how it changes throughout both my own kind of American English understanding of the Vietnamese language and how I understand my family's past and its history. So, a lot of parents would tell kids such as words in Vietnamese, such as thành công, success, difficulty, which is khó khăn, or persevere, chịu khó. But over time, I better understood the nuances of what those different words mean. So this is a creative arts workshop that I've led back in 2019. I'm also committed to different ways of Southeast Asian practice. Here is a panel I hosted on the methods of Southeast Asian feminist work within arts and academia. So besides my community work, I'm engaged in digital humanities and digital pedagogy. You'll get a bit of a glimpse of it through my lecture and how I organize the primary source activities, but I'm very much committed in thinking about digital representation. So here is my project on virtual Angkor, which is a reconstruction of the Khmer Cambodian Empire in the 13th century. And here it really guides students through virtual reality, immersive technologies, and video to have a slow, multimodal, observation-based experience learning about the past and to rethink what it means to quote unquote tour the past. Like we have these images and drawings and different kind of artifacts of the past, and we are able to understand and kind of tour the past. But how do we do this in a way that makes us critical and to rethink kind of a certain type of literacy and inquiry into the historic record? And my commitment here in both digital pedagogy and digital humanities is to cultivate culturally attuned global citizens that just decenter how we understand knowledge, not just from kind of a Western perspective, but to understand also non-Western forms of governance of what it means to have a city. So 13th century Angkor is one such case. So, these are my three different overlapping elements: research, community, and digital humanities. But today's lecture will be more in tune with the history of colonialism in Southeast Asia. If you're interested in the other sides, they're much more available on my website, cindawin.com, as well as misreading.com. So let's jump right into it. So I framed the discussion about colonial Vietnam within two parts: history and agency, and culture and power. So history and agency. For me, this first part really motivates to understand and position the history of Vietnam within the why and the how, this underlying question. So why? Why study the history of Indochina? Um, I argue that I study Indochina not because it's just interesting, but because it is important. There are many assumptions of what, when studying French colonial Vietnam or histories of French colonialism or even colonialism more broadly, is that the assumption is that colonialism brought in these three different elements. First, colonialism meant it was the modern period. Colonialism brought over modernity and Western forms of modernity. So these are assumptions, right? So the second assumption is that it's modernity and all kind of the cultural products and political systems of the West brought to the East were one directional, from France to Vietnam, or even from Britain to India, and it was top down. These infrastructural changes brought down and evenly distributed to the population. And the third assumption is that colonialism, particularly in the case of Vietnam, was an isolated period. It was only in the 1850s to 1950s, about 100 years. And then ultimately, all the kind of impacts of colonialism were undermined by this unified understanding of Vietnamese nationalism and anti-colonialism that overthrew the foreign invaders and overthrew and unified Vietnam. So these are all the three assumptions of French colonialism in Vietnam that I seek to undermine. Instead, what I hope through this lecture, and I hope through our discussion, is that we can better understand a complex understanding of French colonialism in Vietnam. First, to understand and diversify the understanding of modernity. What does it mean to be modern? Is modern only in 19th or 20th century? In actuality, meanings of modernity are quite kind of vague in general. Is it talking about the modern state and modern bureaucracy? Are we talking about kind of Western forms of modern, which comes with like Western capitalism and Western consumerism? But what about kind of other forms of modernity, such as kind of consciousness, awareness of the self in relationship to kind of the larger collective? And that's related to the second part, is that colonialism was highly, highly uneven. Vietnamese experienced a very large diversity of experiences when it talk when we talk about the colonial period. Those who lived in the cities versus the countryside, those who were educated versus not, those of the larger ethnic minority group of the Viet population versus ethnic minority groups, everyone experienced colonialism quite differently. And third, the legacies of colonialism as it impacts the politics, culture, and geography of Vietnam and of the Southeast Asian region is still very much prevalent today. So let's walk through these three kind of takeaway points. The first takeaway point that I seek to walk through is that the significance of studying colonial Indochina is that the creation of national boundaries and national identity was formalized during the French colonial period, and that today shapes contemporary borders and the cultural and political identity of the three nation states that we see today as Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So what is Indochina? What is it? Where is it? And when is it? Indochina is located in what we understand as mainland Southeast Asia. Today, it comprises the countries of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And when we specifically look at Indochina as a period, we think of it as from 1887 to 1954, even though the French conquest in Vietnam began since 1858. So it generally, like the unified Indochina that comprises both Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, was really in the 1880s, a relatively shorter period, 80s to the 50s, so that's about 60 years, right? So when we say Vietnam and Indochina is located in Southeast Asia, I also want to push that Southeast Asia is both a region an idea, but also a field of study, and it has kind of its complexities as a region as well. So Vietnam and Indochina in the region. So we're kind of nesting out to understand the context of Vietnam and French colonial Indochina. So Southeast Asia as a region is really important to rethink because it's very much shaped by geography and the natural climate. So Southeast Asia, as you see here, is connected to both China and India through the monsoon winds. So historically, so we're looking at essentially from before the 18th century, particularly when wind travel was very important for long distance ship travel between the regions. During the months of October to March, the winds would be moving this way, and that's when a lot of travel would happen from China all the way to India. And then, as you see, from March to June, there's a little bit of a lull because the southeast monsoon seasons come back the other direction. So those who are coming from China to India would basically be setting up base in Southeast Asia, would be trading locally and waiting and kind of creating civilizations and communities and networks in Southeast Asia as they wait for the trade winds to bring them back to China. So it kind of goes the other way too, if you're kind of coming from India and then waiting back. So this, I'm talking about intra-Asian travel and Asian kind of cultural exchange. A lot of the trade products that were very much important, particularly to the Southeast Asian region, were spices, particularly the value of pepper, nutmeg, mace, and cloves. You can see this particularly in Eastern Indonesia. Many other valuable trade products such as aromatic wood, resins, and fauna were really important during this time as well. So the other way of how we understand the Southeast Asian region is a division between mainland Southeast Asia and insular. So today, insular are the nation states of Philippines, Brunei, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Timor-Leste or East Timor. In the mainland area today, it's nation states of Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. Another important map, and to think about just the geographic region of Southeast Asia, is to look at the division between lowlands and highlands. So here in green are the lowlands. So you see it a lot here in Cambodia, down in this Mekong Delta region, around this Hanoi region for Vietnam, even here around Bangkok. So in these lowland regions in Southeast Asia, there was high development of wet rice-based agriculture. It's through kind of these lowland technologies that larger populations could be sustained through the production of rice to be able to feed and support cities and communities. So geography is very important because you can then trace the development of societies and economic interests around these lowland areas. That being said, it doesn't mean in the highland areas there weren't populations that grew as well, but just that the highland populations were less densely populated and had a different type of social economy as well as ethnic breakup than in the lowland regions. So geography very much shapes history and political development. So when we're looking at the long history, I'm talking about 2,000 years of history in the Southeast Asian area. So you hear fertile lowlands and plains in mainland Southeast Asia and Java, and that's where a lot of the populations were developing. And that becomes the nucleus of developing states. So the areas I pointed out in the 9th and 13th century was Angkor, and in Myanmar was Bagan, the 11th and 13th century. Dai Viet, so if you go back here, was this region here in the lowland areas around Hanoi. So that was the Dai Viet Empire. And then you have the Sukhothai and Ayutthaya in what is now Thailand, as well as Java and Majapahit in Indonesia. So because our focus is on Indochina, I want to draw just a little bit closer attention to what this means. So for example, at the greatest extent in the 12th century, the Khmer Kingdom encompassed here present-day Cambodia, parts of present-day Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, Myanmar, and even the Malay Peninsula. The kings at Angkor received tribute from smaller kingdoms and even conducted trade within China. So here you have the Dai Viet Kingdom, the Viet Kingdom, you have the Champa Kingdom here on the south. So what's important here to think about regionally is that before the French colonial period in 1858 to 1954, you have these long periods of Vietnamese history, as well as long periods of engagement with other kingdoms, such as I said, the Khmer Empire in the 12th century, right? As well as Champa. But if you look specifically at Vietnamese history, it's loosely schematically broken up into these four periods. You have the period of Chinese domination from the 1st BCE to the 10th century, an independent government called Dai Viet, which I was describing here, with its base in the lowland area around present-day Hanoi, from the 11th to 16th century. During this time, there was also a large other kingdom, the Champa region. And then later on here, you have from 16th to 19th century, the contestation between the north, the loosely speaking, called the Dang Huai, and the Dang Zhang, down in the south from the 16th to 19th century. And then you have the French colonial period. So it's really important to situate and understand this longer history of Vietnam, particularly because what we see as the contemporary S shape of Vietnam is a relatively recent history. That's really only in the French colonial period that we see the regional boundaries of Vietnam to follow this S shape. Rather, even before kind of the 16th century, so we're looking before this period, Vietnam was really only in this Red River Delta basin. All of what we see as like Central and South Vietnam today was the previous kingdoms of the Champa kingdom, the Cham people, was also the Khmer kingdom, and was a very kind of fluid, diverse, ethnically, culturally diverse region of economic trade and a lot of warring states. Since Laos is also part of Indochina, I also wanted to give a bit of regional understanding of the Laos kingdoms as well, which also from 1707 to 79 also had its different contested, broken up different kingdoms. And then later on, from 79 to 93, for about 100 years, was under suzerainty from under Siam, which is contemporary Thailand. So the suzerain is a sovereign or a state having some other control over another state that is internally autonomous. So I bring this up because Laos as a region is also hotly contested, and it was really uh, caught between two different warring powers, conflicting powers, the Vietnamese Dai Viet authorities and the Thai or Siamese authorities, as well as kind of this French colonial construct that I'll talk about next. So I want to at least give a visual understanding of the competing pre-colonial polities before the French colonialism. Competing polities prior to French colonialism in the Southeast Asian mainland region. So here in the 1700s, you have Dai Viet, as I described before, Champa, the influence of the British Empire up here in the western area throughout the Myanmar region. This is the kingdom of Siam. And by 1858, Dai Nam has also invaded and taken over the Champa kingdom in the south. To the left, the Siamese kingdom has also expressed authority and dominance over the Lao territories as well as the Khmer territories. Many other European powers expressed different types of authority and colonialism within the Southeast Asian region. So as in this map here, you have the influence of the British in yellow in Myanmar, at that point called Burma. You have the Dutch in the Dutch East Indies, so today modern day Indonesia. You have the Spanish in the Philippines at the time, the 19th century. You have the French in this Indochina area. However, it's problems like this, or maps like this, that showcase kind of a simplistic schematic understanding of influence in these areas, but don't really kind of overlay and understand the complexity of the colonial experience and how uneven it is, and also how it spanned a long period of time. This map is useful to understand at least the European contestations amongst one another. So the French expressed authority and colonialism within the Southeast Asian area as a reflection of the 1870s rise of the new French government, the French Third Republic, as they were attempting to carve legitimacy both domestically within France and also globally to compete with other European powers, particularly the British, who had set up a base within Burma, but also the Dutch and the Spanish, who had for many years established economic power and colonies within Southeast Asia, in the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines. France was competing with European powers to find a route to both China and India, to find different trade opportunities. Um, and the British had dominated the ports in China and was dominating both the porcelain and the silk trade. So many of the motivations for French understandings of how and why they came to the Southeast Asian regions was for an economic imperialist motivation, especially in understanding kind of economic exploitation and what was seen as economic opportunity for the French. However, it's really important to also have a deeper understanding of what is meant between imperialism and colonialism. These terms are often used interchangeably. So, imperialism is the more general term to often designate a sphere of influence. There's often a center, such as a monarchy. An example of this is that, you know, there were many different types of imperialism as shown in its competing political authorities. There was Chinese imperialism and spheres of influence throughout Asia with tributary networks, as I mentioned before. Even Khmer had its own empire and received tributary networks around. Vietnam, Dai Viet, had its own kind of imperialist ambitions as well, and they conquered and invaded Champa, established different imperialist bases within Cambodia and Laos territories as well. However, for the purpose of this lecture, what we're distinguishing is the unique and different scope and scale of Western colonialism. So Western colonialism is very much, and the focus that we're going to today is the 19th and 20th century Western colonialism, which is defined by these five characteristics: economic exploitation, political dominance, cultural imperialism, and the influence of a mission of bringing civilization or creating a cultural hierarchy of the West over other indigenous populations. Within Western colonialism, there's also systems of internal colonization where there's a hierarchy of colonizers. So, I'll talk about more later, when the French came to Vietnam, they put many Vietnamese within administrative power, and the Vietnamese administrators within this internal system colonized and created systems of oppression within Laos and Cambodia. Another element is settler colonialism, which is bringing over settlers to inhabit the colonial territory. Um, it's and then neocolonialism is the kind of reimposing of imperialist rule by a state, usually a former colonial power, over independent state. So a lot of contemporary debates might pose questions of, was the United States a neocolonial power, or even today, with either French or American or other Western businesses and corporations in contemporary Vietnam, are these kind of neo-colonial impulses to influence and impose either political or economic influence within the area. However, it's really important to just be rooted within the terms of the key fundamentals of political dominance and economic exploitation to understand what is meant by when we discuss Western colonialism. So I was just saying here, there's a long history of European influence and colonialism. When we were talking about the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines specifically, that really was pertained to mainly the 16th and 18th century. Note that even throughout this period of European influence, there's continuing influence and dominance of trade by China, India, and the Arab world within the Southeast Asian region, and have carried on by the long history of the trade winds, the monsoon winds that I showed before. The focus of this lecture and of understanding colonial histories of Vietnam is on the high colonial period pertaining to the 19th and 20th century. So in in terms of high colonialism in mainland Southeast Asia, the long 19th century, there was very much many efforts of centralizing new kind of new polities by new dynasties. So in Burma, there were several wars that were fought with the English East India Company, and then later on, from 1752 to 1886, there was a centralized kind of dynastic power in Burma. In the 19th century, Cambodia became clients to both Siam and Vietnam, and Laos was brought under Siam until it was later seized by France. So this is very kind of schematic just to understand that, it wasn't a wholesale, like the French came in and just like pushed out a unified political authority, but to understand kind of before the French came, there were already existing competing political authorities. As you see here, Burma was just kind of reunified under this Burmese monarchy, and then it was colonized by the British. But then Cambodia was under alliance as both as a client state of Siam and Vietnam. And similar, Laos was also under Siam, and then Vietnam was under this Nguyen dynasty that was able to kind of maintain as a figurehead throughout the French colonial period from 1802 throughout to 1945. So this is a lot of information, so I'm going to move a little bit quickly just so that we can get to kind of the big takeaway picture of understanding colonialism. So the challenge of understanding colonial history of Southeast Asia, as I was saying before, is that it seems as like kind of these simplistic, color coordinated, split up regions of Europe dividing up the territories. But what I want to emphasize is the unevenness of colonialism. Know that the creation of colonial entities was principally based on convenience of administration and political and economic competition out of fear and competition of other European colonial powers. There was a lot of different political internal conflict within these kind of divisions. As I was saying before, French Indochina was ruled as 5 separate kind of territories within one entity, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But there were also large swaths of areas that weren't really touched by colonial administration, such as in the upriver settlements, islands and archipelago states distant from centers, forests, and highlands. So it's really important, like bringing back to this map, that even though colonialism was quite uneven throughout Southeast Asia, there's significant social, political, economic, and cultural structures that were formed during the 19th and 20th century colonial administration, notably in these 4 ways. Many of the national boundaries, the state bureaucracy, even official religions and languages were formalized during the 19th and 20th century. The idea of national culture through kind of Western notions of museums and histories and scientific knowledge deeply shaped the production of knowledge within these regions. So the idea of like Vietnamese national culture or Thai national culture, the influence of colonial capitalism and developments of cities within this period. A lot of this was wrought by infrastructural changes in terms of roads and the division between urban and rural. And many of these changes are seen today. So let's take this apart in a slower way to understand the nuances, details. So as I said, the national boundaries were formalized during the 19th and 20th century, and this shapes a lot of contemporary regionalism throughout Southeast Asia. So ASEAN, the Associated States of Southeast Asian Nations, was founded in 1967. And this was founded in the context of rise of communism and pursuit of a political and economic stability in the region. So now it includes all the Southeast Asian countries except East Timor, who's an observer state. And the focus here is to unify as like the Southeast Asian kind of network of states to have economic and trade opportunities. And often it's in relationship as a stabilizing force to China and China's political influence. So this is one of the legacies of the national divisions and national boundaries from the European colonial period. So let's focus more on French colonial Indochina. So a lot of the administration within Indochina was very heavily bureaucratic. And I'll go through this pretty quickly, but essentially the French colonial state introduced this very elaborate centralized administrative structure with a governor general at the top in the colonial capital of Hanoi. And then each of the governor general, under the governor general, were 5 superior residents in the 5 territories of Indochina. So Indochina was divided first into Cochin China, which is in the south in Saigon, and that was ruled as a direct colony. So that was seen specifically as a colony, while the rest of the other four parts of Indochina were ruled as protectorates. This is important to distinguish because in Cochinchina, essentially, this was ruled most directly and had the most both political and cultural change compared to the rest of the Indochina region. France had a longer period of establishing administrative authority and economic authority in the Saigon Cochinchina region. The politics and legal status of those in Cochinchina were also different. Whereas in the other territories, Tonkin, which is now northern Vietnam, Annam, central Vietnam, Cambodia, which is Cambodia, and Laos, the local pre-colonial administrative authorities of either mandarins or the monarch still maintained some level of authority. And I won't go through this in detail, but there was a elaborate provincial residence and different types of imperial administration bureaucracy that were kind of went down from the highest level to the lowest level into the provinces. Through this heavy French administrative apparatus, there were also many taxes on the production of opium, rice wine, and salt, and that created a heavy kind of tax burden upon the citizens. And there were kind of a different legal plurality within the experiences of colonialism. So to better understand kind of the legal differences within the territories, it's best to also understand kind of how the colonial region of Indochina was created very kind of piecemeal. So from top to bottom, I'll point it out here. So the French first invaded and exerted authority within the Saigon Cochinchina region in green, and then extended into Cambodia in the 1860s. And from there were battles and conflicts exerting authority in Hanoi, Haiphong, expanding in the Tonkin region by the 1880s, and then down by 1883, extending into the Annam Central region that includes terrain which is today Da Nang and Hue, Nha Trang. And then from there, Laos was the last of the territories to be added, and then especially these regions that border Siam, and then this contested region here. So this actually region here is also hotly contested between Siam and the French authorities. But if you look at the time span from when there was influence in Cochinchina, the French invasion in 1859, to when all the five territories were invaded and quote unquote unified under the French colonial administrative apparatus called Indochina, that span that was up until, let's see, 1897 when the Indo-Chinese Union was created. So that's about 40 years. 40 years of kind of different legal, political, economic influence and structure within the region. And it's from this long colonial history that then you can understand why it is like even today when you look at if you go to contemporary like Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon, versus if you go to Luang Prabang or Phnom Penh, why the administrative as well as the infrastructural road developments and changes were so kind of different in terms of the kind of impact of French colonialism within the Cambodia and Laos territories versus the Vietnamese territories, because France had a longer history within the Vietnamese territories, particularly in Saigon, compared to, for example, Luang Prabang. So it's important to contextualize that Indochina was one of the many colonies within the larger French Empire, from French North Africa and West Africa. And here you have the French Indochinese Union. Here, there's, French was exerting different types of authority and French Empire throughout the world in the 19th and 20th century. The other kind of important way of paying attention to geography is that, sure, we have on the right here the construction of French Indochina, but you can see here this geographic construct of unifying Vietnamese, Laos, Cambodia is a very, very politically diverse region into one unity was very fraught. And one way to do this is to look back at geography. So here, you have the lowlands area in green. You have large populations here along the coastline of Vietnam, coastline and down in the Phnom Penh, Cambodia region, as well as the Mekong Delta region. And then you have like Luang Prabang and the mountainous regions of Laos. There's a natural division between like Laos and Vietnam here with all the different mountainous regions. and even like a division within Vietnam of the different mountainous regions. And then here is another wet map of looking at the Mekong River, which moves throughout the Southeast Asian region that also creates a different natural boundary between Laos and Thailand, for example. And these boundaries are like very fluid. Think about a river as a boundary versus a mountain. Rivers are seats and areas of transportation, of movement, of trade. People live across and between rivers. You can see this very specifically in the Phnom Penh and Cambodia and Mekong Delta exchange today, where there's a lot of populations that move and live between Cambodia and Vietnam. So why I bring up kind of the natural boundaries, either through the mountainous or the Mekong River, is that the construct of Indochina is very much external and kind of externally imposed and constructed. So I want to take just three takeaway points as the significance of understanding colonial Indochina. Are these three areas, and then I'll go into detail. First is the impact of colonial exploitation and global capitalism upon both the landscape and society. Second, as I was alluding to, is that official national boundaries and government administration was very fluid in certain mobile areas, such as the Mekong River and highlands. Yet, by these constructions of this like very foreign, heavy-handed, bureaucratic French colonial structure and internal colonization, this exacerbated both ethnic and regional tensions within the area. So during the colonial period, there were tremendous changes in terms of transportation, migration, urbanization, different types of communications and movements, as well as communities. So some of like just the key ways in which the landscape, populations, economy were transformed. There were, the economic motivation of French colonialism was for exploitation. So many different mining industries were set up, transforming the landscape, mining different types of, particularly in the north, um, trying to kind of mine and extract resources in the region. Very noticeably was a plantation economy where, plantation economies did exist prior to the French, but many of social economic uh, divisions were even exacerbated during with the introduction of global capitalism. So pushing on the and pushing and creating a larger rubber plantation economy. So I wanted to at least give a little bit of kind of voice to some of the experiences of what it meant to live and experience life on a plantation rubber plantation. So here is from a song and saying of plantation life that's translated Jambulam from the book Colonialism Experience. So how healthy and beautiful are the rubber trees? Under each one of them, a corpse of a worker is buried. The rubber trees enjoy much better conditions. When they are sick, they rest right away. Eastern doctors, Western doctors busily fuss around them. We can die of exhaustion and sickness. No coffin will receive our dead bodies. So this, and I wanted to introduce a few other primary sources that might be interesting. Another one that might be useful to read that's been translated is from John Thubin. And this is called The Red Earth, a memoir of life on a colonial rubber plantation. And this primary source is a very distinct, unique one because there also is a lot of connection in insight into life on a colonial plantation and how it politicized this revolutionary into and pushed them into kind of critique and anti-colonial communist activity. Another source that's really important to understand the longer history of plantation economies and the role of rubber is Michitake Aso's Rubber and the Making of Vietnam. So as I said, there were many economic transformations that were created within the structure of French colonialism. Only a handful of French colonial authorities and Vietnamese wealthy landowners were managing and at the top of this hierarchical structure. There were many plantation economies around rubber, coffee, and tea, and it intensified an economic system that relied upon indentured and forced labor, many from poor rural communities with very harsh, oppressive working conditions. So besides kind of the plantation economies, the landscape itself was transformed as well. Here you have kind of a showcase of a French imported automobile, the development of roads. So transport infrastructure was very much transformed. Here you have a map of the different railways throughout Indochina. So here you have this blue railway that connected the north down to the southern region. As you can see here, it's really important to think about where the infrastructural development happened. As I was saying before, this happened mainly in the lowland areas. One, because it's easier to construct trains in the lowlands instead of essentially destroying and blowing up um, mountains to create railroads. But this also meant that a lot of the infrastructure and the transportation was concentrated in the Vietnamese territories. There's a little bit from Phnom Penh here. And this railway here then connected Hanoi to Yunnan to China. The transportation infrastructure, besides railroads, is also very much clearly seen in the development of roads and city life. So here you have a tram, but you have different ways of transportation. You have the bicycle, you have different types of rickshaws that were pulled by an individual human pulling along a two-wheeled transportation device. And here city life was very much dramatically transformed. Another resource worth looking into is a graphic novel called The Great Hanoi Rat Hunt, Empire, Disease, and Modernity in French Colonial Vietnam by Michael Van and Liz Clark. And what's important here on this page is how the city landscape transforms. So here you have the division of different types of city, the parts of the city in Hanoi. You have the native quarter, so the indigenous quarter, you have the military district, and you have the French quarter. So many, if you can see kind of even the spatial layout, you see the indigenous quarter is kind of more kind of uneven, like a little bit kind of quote unquote more natural, and there's like it's not like linear, whereas the French Quarter has these grid-like layouts that you would see for roads, for example. And if you go to Hanoi today, you might see the 36 streets of Hanoi that have more of these kind of local industry-based streets that are a little bit more windy compared to the French Quarter down here. What's really great about this graphic novel is it also showcases how, with this construction of these cities, there were also like destruction of temples and shrines and kind of this overlay of this almost imported French-looking city landscape that was quite unnatural. So when I said there were kind of 5 different elements of Western colonialism, I wanted to kind of re-summarize that colonialism in Indochina took these forms. Um, First of all, in terms of economic exploitation and capitalism, this was a French priority. And then political dominance was the introduction of this heavy bureaucratic system. In terms of third, cultural imperialism and the civilizing mission very much kind of carried on throughout both the education system as well as kind of the creation of different types of buildings that kind of like imported this idea of like French aesthetics, French modernity as a cultural hierarchy against Vietnamese kind of indigenous culture. And then what I was getting at before is that internal colonization is that as you can see in this map, a lot of the Vietnamese territories was where the French colonial administration set up kind of their headquarters and often collaborated with the Vietnamese to send them over to Cambodia, to Laos to rule and to be the administrative apparatus. And this is key because, as in point 5, Indochina was not a settler colony. There were not thousands of French who were brought over from France to rule Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Instead, the French relied upon Vietnamese to carry out the colonial apparatus. And this kind of hierarchy of privileging Vietnamese over the other populations in Cambodia and Laos, and even the ethnic minority groups, is, I argue, has created long-term stratification and division and ethnic tensions between Vietnamese and the Cambodia Laos region, but also internally within Vietnam with the majority Kinh, the majority Viet population, and the ethnic minority population. So, as I was mentioning, Vietnam is a very ethnically diverse region. You have the Viet ethnic majority in the lowland areas, which form, I mean, it's debated as to the percentage, but it's about 70 to 80%. Some say it's up to 90%. In terms of those who identify as ethnic Viet. And then in this map too, you have these ethnicity tribes, ethnic minority tribes in the highland areas. You have the Cham, and honestly, I'm hesitant to showcase a map like this because a lot of, as you know, ethnic diversity and how people self-identify varies. There are many kind of political, economic reasons and citizenship reasons why someone might identify as majority Viet rather than having some ethnic diversity within them for political as well as discrimination kind of reasons. So it's very complicated, but the takeaway here is that there's a tremendous ethnic diversity. With this ethnic diversity, there's many different language groups and ways in which Vietnamese as a language is spoken. So Vietnamese, yeah, so this is just the southern region of all the different types of kind of language families that are in the southern region, as you know from I was lecturing before, from pretty much before the 19th century, the southern region was not even understood as part of the Viet people. This was a very ethnically diverse region of Cham, of Khmer, of Lao, of many different other ethnic minority, of Mao, of other Thai groups, and here you have Malayo-Polynesian groups too. So language in Vietnam is really, really complicated. So it wasn't really until the colonial period in the 1880s through to the 1950s that a unified language, Vietnamese, Quốc ngữ, was systematized. Prior to that, as you can see, there's many different types of spoken languages and ways in which both Vietnamese was spoken, either dialectically, vocabulary. There's a tremendous diversity, as well as the different types of Khmer, other types of ethnicity, and the different languages that are associated with different ethnicities and groups. But if we had to characterize what language looked like during the French colonial period, you had spoken language where the masses were majority spoken some form of Vietnamese. Sure, there's like dialectical differences from the north, south, central, and south, but even within that, in the elite and urban environments, you had Vietnamese, you had French, and you also had Chinese as a spoken language. And of course, you also had the ethnic minority languages. In terms of writing systems, there was Vietnamese Quốc ngữ, which was introduced by mainly Portuguese traders in the 17th century. Sorry, Portuguese missionaries in the 17th century, and then popularized also by French missionaries. And then it's under the French colonial period that Quốc ngữ, that's written here with the Romanized system, it looks like QUO with the hat and the accent C and GU, was kind of advanced and developed and popularized was really during the French colonial period, particularly within the 1920s and 30s. Under the French colonial administration system, there was a lot of debate as to what type of educational structures should be mandated. Should all the indigenous population learn French? Should they learn their native languages? Should they learn Khmer? Should they learn Lao or the ethnic languages? Should they learn Viet? And it's really up through the 1920s that a Franco indigenous education system was developed that tried to promote the use of both French and indigenous languages as the written script. So this is when Quốc ngữ became popularized, is in the 1920s, that in primary education, students were mainly learning in Vietnamese and Quốc ngữ, learning how to write and read in Quốc ngữ in this script here, like this. And then up until high school and higher education that they were learning French. And if they were in the city, then they would be more exposed to French, as well as to Chinese and Vietnamese. So when you think of what languages people were speaking and versus writing during the French colonial period, it was very diverse. Depended if you were from the countryside or you're in the cities. If you worked in the administration, then you would be operating in French, as well as Quốc ngữ if you were educated, if you were in Cambodia or Laos. In terms of writing systems, as I was saying, is that there was Quốc ngữ popularized in the 20s and 30s, but also um, French was being used as well as before that. So even before the French colonial system kind of imposed this Franco-indigenous education system, other writing scripts existed as well. So you have Chinese or Sinitic, Juhan, and that was mainly for court documents and administrative documents by the Dai Viet Empire. So before, so this is we're thinking from the 16th century up until the 19th century of the Viet monarchy and the Confucian bureaucratic system. They were mainly using Sinitic or Chinese to hand within administrative documents. And this both was because of the influence of Chinese bureaucratic influence from 1,000 years of Chinese imperialism, but also because Chinese as a kind of global administrative system was very influential and seen as the standard, almost, I mean, the equivalent would be like Latin, for example, where Sinitic was used as an administrative language in many other places, including in Korea and Japan and in Vietnam. So Sinitic was used up until the as the official standardized administrative language. Besides Sinitic, there was also a logographic script of the Vietnamese spoken language called Han Nom. So I want to showcase a little bit of that. So here you have Han Nom or Nom was written in the early 19th century, and it was a now is seen as like a nationalist kind of work of literary arts, but it was actually kind of this interesting, has this backstory, and I won't go into too much detail, but it was basically a rewritten um, kind of like lowbrow story that circulated within China and then was re-envisioned and reimagined by the scholar Nguyen Zu, and it was written in Vietnamese in Nom script, in vernacular Vietnamese, but was written with the script form in the early 1920s. So here, this is called the Tale of Kieu, which is super famous, and here you have this written in Genome, which is using a specific script that's Sinitic based, but using Vietnamese words. So you have to know both Sinitic and Vietnamese language to understand this. And here it is written. And then in the 1920s, it was transliterated into Quốc ngữ. And then here it is translated into English. Within the span of 100 years of human existence, what a bitter struggle is waged between genius and destiny. So there's many different translations of this and also debates, but I wanted to kind of like at least showcase visually the range of written scripts within Vietnam. So the language landscapes were really complex. So as I was saying, during the colonial period, they had this long history of Sinitic within administrative documents. You have Nom, you had the incorporation of French as an administrative language and kind of colonial power, and then you had Quốc ngữ, the Romanized Vietnamese vernacular script of spoken Vietnamese. So this is another project that I've been working on called Technique du peuple ennemi, which was commissioned by a French colonial administrator that's roughly titled the Mechanics and Crafts of the Vietnamese People, or Kỹ thuật của người Việt Nam. And here, this was woodblock printed in 1908 to 1909. And here you can see the use of Nôm, even during the French colonial period. So even though Quốc ngữ was the spoken language that was being used, like Nôm was also like visually depicted in many of the drawings. So here on the left, you have in Han Nôm, it says in sát thứ nhì đặt giấy. So printing, the second step is laying the paper. And then accompanying this visual text with these drawings and the gnome captions was a French caption too that describes femme en train d'un premier of women printing. So here's another interesting case where in Han Nôm it says con nấc mẹ dán ngọn trầu không. So mother sticks a betel leaf on the hip-skipping child, whereas the French describes the caption of this drawing as son aux enfants, caring for children. So you have this like language hybrid landscape of what the different languages that were used in Vietnam. So during the colonial period, to reiterate, Vietnamese or Quốc ngữ becomes the national language. It starts to become standardized and developed in the 1920s because it's being taught in the schools. Many other Vietnamese Quốc ngữ language newspapers were also in existence, and then people would debate, what is the best way to translate and explain the French concept of modernité? Is this like modern? What is this? Is this fun? Is this what kind of words should we use to describe all these new concepts in a vernacular language, and how should we write it? And then this is the kind of a language revolution, a language kind of mentality that is developed, really rooted within the colonial period, and it picks up even more in the post-colonial period, but it has its root in the colonial period. So during the 20s to 40s, there's a completely new body of literature and press of expression that's influenced a lot by global literature, that's brought over by translations into of like Sherlock Holmes from English into French and then into Quốc ngữ, of the Three Musketeers from France, of Chinese stories too that were written in Chinese and then later translated to Quốc ngữ. Um, Other types of genres of literature, geography, newspaper, comics, photography, that really shape a language and literary revolution in the colonial period. So here's just some images to kind of wrap up this section to understand. Here's like an international primary school. Here's an example, and we're going back to the one that I opened the presentation with, of the cover of a Quốc ngữ newspaper, one of the most popular, called Phụ nữ Tân Văn. And here's just like other types of cultural influence. You have like, besides like culture and language, you have also these other leisure practices that are kind of imported and brought over from France, but really kind of materialize amongst the Vietnamese elite urbanites and kind of re-envision like, to be modern is to play tennis, is to read, it should be in the cities. A lot of these debates were happening and the exchanges were happening within the pages of Vietnamese popular press, within Vietnamese literature. Here's an example that I want to spend a little bit of time on. So there are many newspaper debates about the changing world. So there's new technologies, the transformed landscape, what expectations around culture and class and gender. So this is one caricature, Lý Tuệ, that appeared in some of the famous newspapers, Phong Hoa, for example, Morris. So Lý Tuệ, it says Lý Tuệ is very civilized. Like, oh, look, he knows how to put on a sweater. Or here is another kind of drawing here, like to introducing this new type of clothing. And as I was alluding to before, this is one such clothing that today people think as, oh, it's this traditional ancient Vietnamese type of clothing, but actually this type of áo dài was inspired by invented really in the 1920s and 30s by a designer who wanted to hybridize and bring together kind of French aesthetics together with the Vietnamese aesthetics. And you can see here this tunic, the áo, the mer was um, the Vietnamese. He has his pen name, the mer. He actually described kind of this as his own kind of dress, his own type of style. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I have it as one of my works cited, but Martina Nguyen, in her book on cosmopolitanism, really writes a lot about the construction of a Vietnamese kind of cultural identity around clothing that had its formation in the French colonial period in the 20s and 30s. So here's another example of another kind of a jokester way of Lý Tuệ, who is described as this like country bumpkin who comes to the city, and here he is, he's saying, oh, what a convenient road this is. Traveling this way, I no longer have to fear about getting run over by an automobile. I'm no longer afraid of being killed in an automobile accident. But alas, he's actually walking on a railroad train. So it's really interesting because here there's actually a lot of poking fun of and satirical commentary on rural populations coming in the city, experiencing all these dramatic changes and kind of grappling with what it meant, and also kind of alluding to the potential kind of cultural and kind of disparities between a country person, a migrant coming into the city and experiencing potentially dangers of being hit by a car, because that was actually something that happened quite often because of the transformations of the landscape. So to summarize, many changes, transportation, communities, communications during the colonial period. But the question I want to leave you with is, how do these transformations create opportunities for some, but actually disenfranchise others?